Hello, welcome back to AATV Live. I'm your host, Tom Anvil Hibberd, and today we're going to be talking all about UK airsoft law. Now, I want to point out straight away, none of the people on the show today are legal experts. We're not lawyers. Please don't take any of this as legal advice. We're going to take you through the way the law is written as it stands, and then we'll talk about how it came about and the history behind it. So, without going on much further, I'll introduce my guests for today. And you'll see we have three of them. So we have Phil, Ben and Gaz. How you doing, guys?
Hi, Tom. All right, mate. Hi,
Tom. You're right.
I'm very good. Okay, guys. So if we can start with Phil, if you do a very brief introduction to yourself. I know we've done this loads of times before, but let's just, for people that are new to the show, let's let them know who we are.
Okay. 28 years counting playing Airsoft. Before it was even a thing. Many years helping to run a site, helped start UKAPU as a players' organisation with Gaz and a few other guys years and years ago. Wrote for Airsoft International, now Airsoft Action, and also run Clearwater Airsoft, my own sort of social media page and content.
Excellent. Ben, I know you've done this before, but...
Big M4 fan. Big M4 fan.
Shut up. Okay, Ben, just a little bit about you, and maybe just touch on the stuff that's pertinent to today's discussion.
Oh, yeah. As a lot of people might recognise my name, I used to write for Airsoft Action magazine. Got a lot of stuff from Phil back in the day as well, back then. Moved on to work for Action Sport Games and basically been working in the airsoft industry along with these great guys for a little while now. Probably most pertinent to today's discussion, I did actually take part in some of the meetings and sort of debates based around forming the current legislation up for UK airsoft. Putting airsoft side over to the kind of wider firearms industry and wider firearms kind of council. A lot of the time they kind of don't really understand us, but we try to make our voice heard as best as possible. But that's probably what I'm going to bring to the table this time round.
Great, and on to you, Gaz.
Next month will be my 30th year in Airsoft. I started in May 1990. Since then, I've ran sites. I've been involved with retail, wholesale, various player body setups, and also the initial stages of the VCRB discussion.
Cool, thank you very much. Okay, so for the people that have joined us, again, we're going to talk about UK airsoft law, and again, we're not experts. What we're going to do is we're going to, probably mostly me, is talk about and read out some of the actual law as it pertains to airsoft at the moment in the UK, and then the second half of the show, hopefully it'll be more than half, we'll talk about the kind of hows and whys and the history, because it's really interesting and it puts everything into a bit more context. So I think something that we've been chatting amongst ourselves, and something that's really come one thing that's come up is that airsoft has really inadvertently been swept up in a whole raft of other legislation. It was never targeted and it was never intended to be this way. What do you reckon, guys?
Yeah,
I'd agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah. When they wrote those legislation documents, I don't think they had a clue what airsoft was or that it even existed at that point.
Yeah.
It's just
the way they...
Sorry, Phil. No, airsoft's like a pretty, no matter how big it gets and no matter how many live streams we do or how many magazines there are about it or how many social media sites there are about it, the scope of airsoft kind of pales in comparison to things, mainstream stuff. It's never going to be a big mainstream thing. Even compared to paintball, it's still fairly niche. So I think a lot of the time when it's discussed on a legal sense, it's not really understood by the people that are talking about it. Why would they know anything about it? It's just something that nerds do, really.
I think that there's something that can be quite easily misunderstood is that prior to the VCRB being introduced, there was no social media platforms where people found airsoft easily. There was no mainstream media coverage of airsoft. If you wanted to find out about airsoft, you got invited to airsoft. And that's how we inadvertently got scooped up by the VCRB when it got introduced to the House. And obviously, because of that, we've had to become more visible, had to become more mainstream, and that's how a lot of people are finding out about Airsoft now.
Yeah. Okay. So earlier, again, Gaz, you made a comment that Airsoft as an activity is not restricted at all. So there's no, Airsoft isn't a controlled activity. However, but because we use Airsoft guns that are realistic, that then means that the guns themselves are restricted because they're replica imitation firearms. Okay, and so you can probably turn off now, but that's the crux of what we're going to discuss today. Airsoft itself isn't a restricted activity, but because we use realistic-looking guns, or realistic imitation firearms, we get affected by the law. Okay? Let's do a bit of jargon busting, because we're going to start using a lot of acronyms in the next hour or so. So does anyone want to do VCRA?
Go on,
Yeah,
I'll
sure.
take that one.
Go on then.
The Violent Crime Reduction Act, which followed on from the VCRB.
So the VCR bill was then put to Parliament. When it came into legislation and was enacted, it became the Act. That's the way it works in the UK. Okay, we've got RIF. Replica imitation firearm. We're going to explain what a RIF is later. It does get slightly complicated. We've got an
Is
IF.
it not realistic imitation firearm?
So realistic. Sorry, guys. Okay, brilliant. So realistic. Thank you very much. Feel free to correct me. Realistic imitation firearm. See, even I get confused. I spent 3 days reading all of this. What's an IF?
So an imitation firearm is something that shouldn't exist. Sorry, it's an imitation firearm.
Okay. And again,
which is basically something that's not completely realistic.
Yeah, but it has. Yeah, and we'll go into it. There's
We get to the caveats.
Yeah, some very specific caveats. It's really strange. Okay, we've got the PCA, Ben.
Oh, Police and Crime Act, isn't it?
Yeah,
Something
sounds
like
good.
that.
Sounds good to me. That'll do. UKARA. And again, we'll go into this later. So,
are we going to be tested on this? Does this go towards our final mark?
Yeah, okay. I'll bang through.
This counts towards your license.
Don't you say. You'll get them going. So I've got blue lights behind me already. So, okay, UKARA, so United Kingdom Airsoft Retailers Association, is that right?
Yeah, that's
okay.
right.
Okay, and UKAPU, Phil, your special
the
subject.
UK Airsoft Players Union, which is a players' association. Okay,
so the next bit... Okay.
It's worth pointing out there is actually a third one of the Trinity that existed that's sort of gone by the wayside, but I believe still exists, and that's the UK ASGB, which was the UK Airsoft Sites governing body.
Yeah.
And there'll be another one which is now defunct, which will come up in a bit. Okay, so this next bit, hold your horses. It's not going to be the most exciting thing in the world. I'm largely going to be reading pertinent bits of legislation. But I think it's important because this is the stuff which doesn't get, when there's arguments online about legalities and legal stuff, this is the stuff which gets misquoted or it's an interpretation. So I'm not going to do all of it, but we'll do the most pertinent bits because I think that's quite important to get it out, to frame the discussion that we're going to have later. Okay? Sorry about it, guys. You might have to just hold on for a little bit.
It's all right. I'll
Hello.
Okay, so the most pertinent bit was the VCRA 2006, so the Violent Crime Reduction Act 2006. This effectively, it created the offence of manufacturing, importing and selling's quite important, of realistic imitation firearms. So if you were to a person is guilty of an offence if he manufactures realistic imitation firearm, he modifies an imitation firearm so that it becomes a realistic imitation firearm. He sells a realistic imitation firearm, or he brings a realistic imitation firearm into Great Britain, or causes one to be brought into Great Britain. This section, the subsection, has some defences that we'll talk about in just a minute. Okay, so a lot of people think it's an offence to buy a RIF or an airsoft gun. And that's not the case, according to this. It's down to the seller to be sure that the person has a legitimate use. Yeah. Is that right? Is that right, guys?
Yep, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
however, the import is a different matter and the manufacturer is a different matter. But...
Yeah. Do you want to briefly touch on that then? If you've got something.
So, When it comes to the transfer, i.e. sale, it's down to the seller. However, when it comes to the import, it's down to the importer, the person receiving it, recipient, not to the person sending it, because they are outside of Great Britain.
Okay.
So it's not up to an international seller to ask you for your defence, although most do, because it's you as an importer, as the recipient, that's responsible for it.
Yeah. So, for example, I've just bought an M16A1 SEMA from Gunfire in Poland. They're quite good. They ask for your defence, or they actually specifically ask for a UKARA. But yes, if you can just, it's very easy to buy stuff online, bring it in, and if you don't have a defence, you can be in real trouble.
Do you think that might not just be a result of kind of practically enforceable law there? And the guys that are in foreign countries that are allowing you to purchase and import your own gun, the reason they're asking you for it is because of distance selling regulations and things like that. If they don't ask you for it, they're going to be on the receiving end of a load of complaints. Somebody on TripAdvisor or Yell or whatever it is, giving both barrels in the negative review comment section. My package has been held in customs because they didn't ask me for it. And perhaps the only reason they're really they're kind of asking for it is to stop the negative connotations on them. If they're aware of it, they'll just put that in there and say, look, if you can't provide us with your defence, we're not even going to sell to you, because in all likelihood it's going to get stuck at Border Force and you're going to get a letter and you're not going to be able to ever get it out of Border Force. So we've just thrown our stock out the window. You'll complain to PayPal. PayPal will send you your money back because it never got to you. That seems to be, although there's kind of a disparity in the law there, it actually seems to be kind of built around sensibility, doesn't it? It's what can be enforced by who.
I think what you said at the end there, PayPal, is the biggest factor, because if someone gets it seized and destroyed, because of the way PayPal is quite geared towards buyer protection rather than seller protection, they will give the money back to the person who bought it, even though it's the person who bought it that broke the law.
Yeah.
Okay, I think one thing. Sorry, Ben. One thing I want to touch on here is that this is Section 36, the VCRA 2006. It's still an offence, even if you have a defence. You have a defence. Am I correct in saying you have it? Yeah. And we'll lay those out in a minute. But you have a defence from prosecution. It's still illegal to do those things, to manufacture, modify, sell, or import.
Isn't it classed as a defence on the face of the law, or on the face of the Act, or something like that? Yeah. So you're still breaking the law, but you've got a get out of jail free card.
As I understand it, you could probably still be taken to court. You could still be taken to court, and you could say, "Oh, well, I've kind of got this defence." They could probably say, "Actually, no, we don't believe you are acting in the spirit of the defence, so we're going to carry on with the actual pitching or the charge or just whatever it would be."
I think there's a really key word that Ben used then, and I think it's going to come up quite a lot during this discussion, and it's spirit of defence. And it's an unspoken bit that is actually more key to a piece of legislation that's not been tested in court than anything, because it's that spirit of the defence that will be the key to a defence if it ever happens to an airsofter. And
it's all conjecture, isn't it, really, at the moment?
It really is. And if you break down what the defence is actually a lot simpler than whether UKARA or anyone actually decides is their criteria. That criteria was made to make sure that we were being safe and policing ourselves. It's beyond what the law says it needs to be, but for good reason. We haven't had a problem.
Okay, so let's move on very quickly to the defences. I'm going to stop at the next section, which is the Secretary of State may by regulation provide for exceptions and exemptions from the offence under subsection 1. That's the offence of replica imitation firearms. And
I'm glad you said that now, Tom, because after a couple of cans, you're never going to be able to get that out.
I'm going to lose it by the end of this, I tell you. Okay, what that effectively means is they didn't want to list. I've checked some of the notes on this. They didn't want to list everything as a defence in this document, because that would have just gone mental. So what they've allowed the Secretary of State to do is to create additional defences, exceptions and exemptions at a later date. Because in the VCRA, there is no mention of airsoft whatsoever.
No.
It does not exist, and obviously, and we'll get into that when we do the history. But obviously, that was a bit of an issue at the time. In fact, we'll get a bit more into it later down. Okay, so Section 37, which is again still on the VCRA. This lays out the specific defences from prosecution. Okay, those purposes are effectively a museum or gallery, theatrical performances and rehearsals for such performances, the production of films. That doesn't actually mean YouTube.
No.
The production of television programs. That also doesn't mean YouTube. The organisation of holding of historical reenactments organised and held by persons specified or described for the purpose of this section by regulations made by the Secretary of State. So they're going to be quite specific about what a reenactment is, and they do later on. And the purposes or functions that a person has in his capacity as a person in the service of Her Majesty. Okay, and again, there is no mention of airsoft in that defence.
No.
So that caused a fair bit of consternation at the time.
Is airsoft even real?
Okay,
you could be forgiven for completely forgetting about it at this point in time, couldn't you?
Yeah, so we're still not onto airsoft, and actually, as we go further and further through the documentations, airsoft comes in really quite late. It's really quite tenuous. Okay, so that, and then what happened? As I talked about earlier with the regulations from Secretary of State, that's where the defence for airsoft comes in at a later date. But obviously, at the time, it was a bit squeaky bum time, to use a technical legal phrase. Section 38 goes on to actually define what a realistic imitation firearm is. And it means an imitation firearm which has an appearance that is so realistic as to make it indistinguishable for all practical purposes from a real firearm, and it is neither a deactivated firearm nor it is itself an antique. So really old guns, and I'm sure we all know what a deactivated firearm is.
Do we know what the legal definition of an antique actually is?
Yeah,
it's over 100 years old, I think.
Pre-1890.
1870. Yeah, 1870. Yeah.
So is that a sliding scale? Does that change every year, or
no?
No.
It's been set as 1870.
So antiques are going to get older and older and older as time goes on.
There's also obsolete antique as well. So if something's of an obsolete caliber, it's classed as an antique too.
Well, like 8mm.
6.44 millimeter.
Oh yeah. Full crust or whatever it was.
Stop.
Okay, so what this affects? So imitation firearm is anything which effectively, and if you look at the 1968 Firearms Act, an imitation firearm is anything which basically looks like a gun. Could be a Nerf gun, could be a paintball gun, could be a toy gun, could be a bright,
piece of wood.
Could be a piece of wood carved to look like a gun. It could be anything which may cause alarm. Effectively, is an imitation firearm. And most of the law previous to this is where this realistic, I'm saying the right thing, realistic imitation firearm comes in, because previous to that it didn't exist under UK law. That this is when it came in, and they've made the caveat that it can only be distinguished by an expert, by close examination, or as a result to attempt to load and fire it. If you look at the notes, an expert is basically a firearms officer. That's the level of.
One thing worth pointing out there, Tom, as well, is that when it comes to a realistic imitation firearm, it doesn't matter whether it launches a projectile or not. It's something that people get very confused over.
Yeah.
It's not the fact it's an airsoft gun; it's the fact that it looks like a gun.
It could fire bubbles.
Nothing.
It could be nothing. It could just be an inanimate object that looked enough like a gun. You know, like a WWE gas blowback or something like that.
So do not let your bananas go to.
Part of that is because it's a subset of imitation firearm, and then you have to go and track the imitation firearm law from the 1968 Firearms Act, which talks about what Gaz has just said. It doesn't matter if it fires a projectile or not. If it looks like a gun, vaguely looks like a gun, it can cause alarm. It's an imitation firearm. And then a riff is just.
You can't buy like realistic looking toy cap guns anymore. Like when we were kids, cap guns look like guns, and now they're all blue or orange or green. You know, see what? It doesn't matter if it looks like a gun. If somebody, as a layman, thinks it's a gun, or a police officer thinks it's a gun, as far as they're concerned, it's a gun.
It's a gun.
Yeah.
Mrs. Miggins down the street.
Favourite cap gun of all time. Sorry, guys. My favourite cap gun of all time was actually a flintlock mini sort of pistol thing that my granddad got out, and apparently he built it as a kit, and my uncle had it, and I got it sort of passed down, but it was actually like a flintlock pistol kind of thing, and it fired caps. It was well cool. I reckon you could still have that nowadays without it being blue, though, because it's an antique.
An antique,
Yeah, pre-1870.
What I was going to say is we may as well apologise to all those UK military guys now who are watching this going, they're not guns, guns are mounted on bipods and ships. When we're saying gun, we mean the colloquial term of gun, not necessarily military. So otherwise you get lots of hate.
Okay, so there's a lot of stuff I'm not going to quite go into about imitation. I might go into it a bit actually later, but we might do that later on rather than reading all the imitation firearm regulations out to you right now. Okay, but we still haven't had any mention of airsoft.
No.
So, and again, it's all bound into this realistic imitation firearm stuff, and we need to keep reinforcing that point because that's yay cat. Okay,
Hey.
so in order,
Last time he loves this.
so you might ask, where is the defence for airsoft? Okay, for that you have to go to the really exciting document, Statutory Instrument 2007 number 2606. Well, hey, on everyone's top list of reading, and this is part of the problem because anytime you go looking, if you Google UK airsoft law, you'll get references to shop terms and conditions, and if you're lucky, you'll find UKAPA website, which is pretty good. But most of it, you generally won't. It's not all contained. It's not in one place. It's spread out between different acts, and it's all over the place, and over about 50 years of legislation. Okay, so this statutory instrument we talked about ages ago, that Secretary of State being allowed to make regulations to provide exemptions and exceptions and defences, and this is where it comes in. So the first thing I'm going to read out is really important, and this is the interpretation, and this really is where airsoft comes in, even though it doesn't mention it, and it defines what a permitted activity is. Okay, and a permitted activity for a defence means the acting out of military or law enforcement scenarios for the purposes of recreation. Okay, and we'll go into exactly what that means. Well, no one knows exactly what it means, but we'll go.
It'd be good if you could go into what it means.
Can I just say what it doesn't mean?
What doesn't it mean?
Pink lycra and dye-for masks.
I don't know. I've seen guys that are in the army do a lot weirder stuff than that, to be honest, guys.
Okay, so I'm going to read that again because it's important. It means the acting out of military or law enforcement scenarios for the purposes of recreation. Okay, now that's not the defence, but that's a definition that leads into defence. So the defence, okay, everyone hold your hats. It shall be a defence in proceedings for an offence under Section 36 of the 2006 Act, or under Paragraph 4 of Schedule 2 to that Act, for the person charged with the offence to show that his conduct, when they say his, they mean he or male or female, it's just a law thing, show his conduct was for the purpose of only making the imitation firearm in question available for one or more of the purposes specified in Paragraph 2. Those purposes are, and this is the defence, the organisation and holding of permitted activities for which public liability insurance is held in relation to liabilities to third parties arising from or in connection with the organisation and holding of those activities. And fundamentally, ladies and gentlemen, there is your airsoft defence. In short term, they're really focusing heavily on insurance and organisation. So that means if you go and play with your riffs in the woods without any insurance or without any organisation, you do not have that defence, and you've just taken your riffs out in public, effectively, even if you're driving to those woods without any reason. Gaz?
I'll say this though, there is no law restricting ownership of those riffs. So even though you're doing that, you are not breaking the law at that point. If you if you import or manufacture one with the intent to do it without insurance, then you're breaking the law.
Yeah, it's interesting though because it's quite specific about making available for, and reading the notes. That means if you travel to somewhere with your riff and you don't have a good reason for it, and that's the good reason, you're in trouble. And actually, this happened to Land Warrior, Airsoft Edinburgh. Scott Allen caught some dudes on his site. They're not covered. They're not covered.
No.
So a lot of the time, people, just to make it clear for me here, A lot of guys say, the actual act of purchasing the RIF is illegal. But then also you're saying that it is also illegal to use that in an activity that isn't covered by third-party insurance.
It's legal to have it in public.
Yes, legal to have it out in public place. Yeah. But if you were to do, you need, so in order to be out in public, you need to have a defence that is defence. And they're very, very key talking about insurance and organisation. And, and an event. And an event means 2 or more people, one of which has to have public liability insurance.
You literally and legally cannot go to a field and say, we are playing airsoft, even if there are 40 of you, if that isn't insured, if that isn't a legitimate activity. If they go by the strict letter.
If they go by that strict letter,
Yeah. Now, there's a lot of what we're talking about gives the police and the judiciary discretionary powers.
Mm. I'm just thinking, you can't have a flash mob airsoft game if there's a bunch of you there.
No.
Even if you all legitimately hold those guns, there's no legal standpoint for you to actually do anything with them.
It's the public gathering bit that's...
Yeah. Someone's just mentioned in the comments, what about back gardens? Fine, if you're seen and you cause alarm, you're in big trouble. Not big trouble, but you could potentially be in a lot of trouble. So if you do use your riffs in the back garden, it's always, I'll get to you in a minute, guys, it's always a good idea, if you can, to talk to your neighbours first and let them know what you're doing.
Yeah, definitely worth speaking to neighbours. But on the flip side to that, if you're in your own property and someone has to have gone out of their way to see you, then you're not guilty of any offence.
But also, if you have them lying around in your house and they can be seen from a public road, that's also an offence. Because okay, now it's not an offence under the VCRA, but it's an offence under the 1968 Firearms Act.
Firearms Act, isn't it?
Again, and that's why you have to. All this stuff is coming in from all over the place.
So basically, you flying a flag, a big American flag with an M4 in the middle of it, with "Fuck you, America" in the middle of it. Probably not a great idea because it's just going to cause alarm to people, and the police might turn up at some point and say, "Can you take that flag down?" And you're not being trodden on, or your rights aren't being infringed. You're just being told to stop being a bit of a tit, aren't you?
Yeah. So now it's unlikely it's unlikely that they're going to come kicking down your doors, though it has happened to people.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, it has happened. I know some airsofters have had visits, quite quiet visits from the local constabulary, just to check what's going on. One of your neighbours has mentioned you might have a thing. Can we just have a little chat about it? And then you have to have a conversation about it.
The common one is on importation or after an importation, even months after you can have a visit.
So yeah, if you do,
my neighbours are kind of surprised if I'm not in the garden playing with guns. To be honest,
they come around knocking just to check if you're all right.
Yeah.
Okay, Graham Hoffman.
We haven't heard any gunfire for weeks. Are you okay?
Mr. Graham Hoffman has asked us, what about, but Tom, I'm a cosplayer.
That's a whole other kettle of fish.
It is.
It could be argued, but again, it would need to be the acting out of military and law enforcement scenarios for purposes of recreation in a group of two or more people, one of which has public liability insurance. Okay?
Yep.
That's and you can get away.
Sonic the Hedgehog with an AK though.
That might be a law enforcement scenario.
Again, we're not legal experts.
Is there any statement that it has to be an actual law enforcement scenario, or it could be a law enforcement scenario?
We'll discuss that.
I'll
discuss that in a bit, Ben, because I want to get through this.
Go for it.
Get through this stuff before we kind of bog down in the. Okay, so bear in mind, guys, we've still not heard anything about airsoft in any of this legislation I've read out. Doesn't exist. So finally, in the explanatory memorandum to the Violent Crime Reduction Act 2006. So this isn't legal. This is just notes that explain to people what it actually means. Okay, and we finally get to, I'll paraphrase because it's not legal. Whilst the Act was going through Parliament, the government finally accepted that realistic imitation firearms were needed intrinsically as part of airsoft skirmishing. Intrinsic is a really interesting word. Airsoft skirmishing is a recreational activity in which participants act out military or law enforcement scenarios, so we go back to that again. The government undertook to provide a suitable defence which would not undermine the overall policy intention. This defence is set out in, we've just read it before. An important part, and here we go, important aspect of this defence is the requirement that third-party public limited liability insurance must be held as a means of ensuring the defence is limited, ready for this, genuine organised airsoft skirmishing. Now that's not legal, but that's an interpretation. But that shows the intent of what they were trying to achieve.
Exactly. And it's really important to realise that this was only done because we flagged it up with the government at the time, the Labour government at the time, that brought it forward. And I know that there's a lot you see on Facebook now when someone mentions UKARA, for instance, and there's all the Demon Society who want to rule airsoft. The reason why we have a defence now is because we required stakeholders, as the law calls them, to put themselves forward, and stakeholders are people who have a vested financial interest in a piece of society that's going to be affected by a new piece of legislation. The hobby people, the hobbyists, the players, if you like, can't have a vested interest as hobbyists. Okay. Only businesses could be stakeholders as a vested interest because they have a financial vested interest, and therefore we required sites and retailers to get together to form an association to have someone to speak to the government because we couldn't speak to them as hobbyists.
Do you think that is to get away from an emotional response to the law and to try and get some sort of, kind of rational and constructive response to what's being proposed? Or is that just to kind of thin the herd a little bit?
I think all it is because, the way our law is formed, you require a stakeholder status to make yourself heard without the requirement for having like a 100,000 petition put in place, which we wouldn't have got. There weren't enough airsoft players in the country at the time
to have even been heard. They reckon 10,000 at the time.
Yeah,
exactly.
I've just found
Less
than that, probably.
So all these crazy petitions that we get put online now, sign this to get the government to do this, that, and the other. They're potentially, they don't actually have any stakeholders mentioned or anything like that. Is that still the case, or is that
That's a different thing?
It's a different thing. Petitions are to be heard in Parliament, to be read in Parliament.
Okay.
As to oppose a bill that's coming in, you need to have stakeholder status. You need to have someone that's going to be affected. So, if, for instance, they brought in a new piece of legislation restricting the sale of used cars over 5 years old, it's no good the vintage car racing clubs coming forward and saying, hey, we've got members all over the place that race cars that are over 5 years old or collect cars over 5 years. You've got to have the people that sell them or have another financial vested interest to come forward and say, hey, our businesses and our taxes are going to be affected by this new bill. And if you want to have future taxes, you're going to have to actually take us into account. That's essentially what you're doing.
Right.
And we couldn't do that as hobbyists. We needed the shops and we needed the sites at the time to come forward and do that for us. And that's what happened.
And ideally, you need somebody in the House, either House Lords. I think it was the House of Lords for us, wasn't it? Baroness something or other, who at the 11th hour came to our aid.
Well, we were lucky in the sense that because at the time it was new Labour government, this and the other, there was quite a lot of opposition from the Conservative benches into. They like their shooting sports anyway, so we had to rely on Conservative benches to defend it. So at the time they were our allies big time.
Yeah. Okay. So it was quite a stressful time. I remember writing to my MP several times, and I went to his surgery and sat down and explained to him all of the stuff. Okay, so but we've not really. So we've had a vague mention of airsoft skirmishing. We need another document. This gets ridiculous. To kind of explain where we are now with UKARA, and this is the Violent Crime Reduction Act commencement number 3. So this is when it actually went into power. So it was voted on, but when it was voted on and passed by the Houses, it didn't necessarily pass into legislation straight away. It had to be commenced. There was a date set for it. Yeah. So this one is commencement number, and it was also commenced in lumps. It didn't all go through at once. It went through in different sections because there needs to be regulations done by the Home Secretary, as we've already discussed, for each of those sections that went through. So this is commencement number 3. This 2007. This bit comes from the firearms measure. So this is everything. This is also everything to do with air guns, crossbows, pistols, all that stuff got lumped together. And the document I'm going to quote from is a Home Office circular. So again, this isn't legislation. This is guidance to chief police officers around the country on what to do and what the measures meant, and then how they're going to be implemented. Okay, so first of all, it runs through the stuff we've already talked about, and then I'll start reading again, and then we'll talk about it. Section 36, subsection 3, gives the Secretary of State a power to provide for further exceptions, exemptions, or defences. That was the airsoft defence. Well, that was the permitted activity defence we've talked about. This power has been excised to make the Violent Crime Reduction Act Regulations 2007. These regulations provide for 2 new defences. The first is for the organisation and holding of airsoft skirmishing. This is defined by reference to permitted activities. The permitted activity being, for people that just joined the stream, the acting out of military and law enforcement scenarios for the purposes of recreation. I'm going to make a T-shirt with that on, I think.
There's quite a big word count, though, for print.
And the defence only applies where third-party liability insurance is held in respect to the activities. They're really, really keen on that organised event with insurance. And I don't think we can stress that enough. The second new defence is for the purpose of display at arms fairs. That doesn't really cover us, but what they wanted to do is to allow people to display realistic imitation firearms at a fair and not have an actual gun there. Kind of makes sense, really. So it goes on for airsoft skirmishing, and you guys can explain this a bit further when we get on. The Association of British Airsoft is putting in place arrangements to allow retailers to check that the individual purchasers are members of a genuine skirmishing club or site. The key elements of these arrangements are, I'm going to stress this is a note, this is a circular and not legislation. And this was quite hard to find. It took me a while. The key elements of this arrangement are new players. This is going to sound very familiar to a lot of airsofters. New players must play at least 3 times in a period of not less than 2 months before being offered membership. Membership cards with a photograph and recognised format will be issued for production to retailers. A central database will be set up for retailers to cross-check. The defence for individual skirmishing, this is interesting, can apply to individual players because their purchase of realistic imitation firearms for this purpose is considered part of the holding of a skirmishing event. I seem to remember for a long time they were discussing clubs holding all the riffs and then only dealing them out in a secure location and then only dealing them out on a game day. And then it goes on to define a realistic imitation firearm as an imitation firearm which has an appearance that is so realistic to make it indistinguishable for all practical purposes from a real firearm. Imitation firearm is defined in Firearms Act 1968. Okay, so we've discussed the defence, but what this does is this then allows people. This was set up to allow people. Let's let you guys go into this because I'm going to get a bit tongue-tied at the moment. Gaz,
who wants to do ABA?
who wants to do ABA, and what happened to ABA, and why do we have a UKARA? Because this sounds like UKARA to me.
Phil, do you want to do it or shall I?
You take it, mate. I'll do the next one.
Okay. ABA was the umbrella organisation under which we were supposed to have a players' organisation, a retail association, and a sites governing body underneath this overall umbrella of the Association of British Airsoft. And that was how we went into Home Office discussions, was under this umbrella of the ABA. However, there was never a players' association at the time. It never got off the ground. And UKSGB was kind of in its final throes at that point as well. Although there are pieces of the notes to legislation that you've read out that I can hear. They're the bits that the UKSGB definitely had input into. Yeah. But yeah, the ABA was the overall association that was supposed to be our overarching overseer to the defence after the act.
Like a governing body, really, sort of thing, isn't it? Or similar.
Well, we use the words governing body. But yeah, it was supposed to hold the keys to the database essentially. And then it vanished. And UKARA to be fair, it was decided that they should fund it because they were the ones that had a vested interest. They were making money from Airsoft, so therefore they should pay for it. And that's why sites and players don't pay to go on the database, and retailers pay to have that database maintained and to have access to it, is because of that arrangement.
The stunned silence.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So that largely. Okay, I'm going to dive onto the Firearms Act 1968 because we've referenced it several times, and I want to complete this, and then we can do more of a standard questions and answers. Carrying a firearm in a public place, a person commits an offence if without lawful authority or reasonable excuse. We've been through the reasonable excuses. The proof whereof lies with him. So you have to prove to the authorities why you have that thing and why you have a good reason to have it. He has with him on a public place. It goes through some stuff. Number D, an imitation firearm. A RIF is a subset of an imitation firearm. You commit an offence if you have a RIF in a public place without reasonable excuse. The next thing, and Ben, this may be where you start coming into this, with the Policing and Crime Act in 2017.
Yeah.
There was, so let me get this right. They were kind of tidying up a load of stuff, and there was going to be a sweeping generalisation that any barreled weapon over one joule was considered a lethal barreled weapon. And we can get into the definition of lethal barreled if you can remember in a bit. And obviously, a one joule lethal barreled weapon is far less powerful than some of the barreled weapons. Not even, we'll get into this in a minute. That we use in airsoft to do airsoft skirmishing. So this was obviously going to cause somewhat of an issue, and there was a lot of work done at the time. Do you want to briefly just whiz over some of that?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, working with the magazine I worked with at the time, which was quite hand in hand with a lot of the retailers that we were working with, advertising interests and things like that, and obviously as a business that relied on airsoft and airsoft's continuation. It was a point in time where I think airsoft was going to get swept up in some other legislation, as it quite often does, and be pretty much inhibited by somebody, stroke of a pen, possibly intending to wipe some other crime out or to criminalise something else. And airsoft would be caught up in that. I remember having some conversations at the time, sort of, people, this will actually mean that this is no longer, your AEG is no longer legal. It unintentionally made illegal by this legislation that's coming to pass. And I was invited to go along to a law symposium before they were putting together this act. And we had to kind of fight the corner and say, look, airsoft is still legitimate. We still require guns of over a certain power level, and basically convince people that we do skirt this line between it being a toy and it not being a toy and it not being a firearm as well. There needed to be a definition of this gun.
I think at the time, airsoft, so there was a realistic imitation firearm. But the internals and the gubbins that fired the projectile weren't really defined. They were just it was this nebulous grey area thing.
I mean, I've got to be honest. I think a lot of it probably came about or was fed into the sort of system by people trying, after nearly 10 years, trying to then sidestep the legislation that was in place. The legislation's been in place and people have kind of got used to it. They're looking for holes in it. They're looking for loopholes. They're looking to exploit exceptions. And, maybe if we jack the power up of this gun, we can actually sell it as an air weapon. And it's still not an air weapon because it's still not deadly. But then it's just putting a realistic looking a RIF into somebody's hands and actually making it more dangerous than it was before, because they've powered it up a little bit more. At any point, we're probably never going to get to actually dangerous power levels, and we're still well shy of what is a legal air weapon. But yeah, I think a lot of it kind of stepped in because people were, for want of a better word, starting to take the piss a little bit. And now it came around and it needed rounding up again and say, well, actually, no, after nearly a decade of this being in force, we need to now define what actually is an airsoft gun. And then this whole lethality thing was brought up. And it's something that's been fairly hotly debated and what kind of has led into current airsoft debates now. We no longer seem to argue quite so much about the VCRA and UKARA licenses and all that shite anymore. We tend to sort of argue a little bit more about this sort of power level thing because it is a little bit more pertinent. And one of the biggest hits is the power levels of guns and the differentiation between a full auto gun and a gun that. And you'll probably be able to help me out with the exact wording.
Yeah, I've got the exact word. Well, let's do it now because we just brought it up. So the Policing and Crimes Act basically amended the Firearms Act 1968, and I'll just get the exact word. An airsoft gun is not to be regarded as a firearm for the purposes of this act. And then it goes on to define what an airsoft gun is. So, and this is where some of the I got confused with what Gaz was saying earlier because we're talking about airsoft guns, and there's airsoft gun big A, big G, which is defined under law, and there's an airsoft gun which people hold, and it all gets a bit confusing sometimes. An airsoft gun is a barreled weapon of any description, which is interesting. So it could be a square plastic box with a button on it, or it could be a riff, or it could be an imitation firearm. This bit of legislation doesn't care what it looks like. Which is designed to discharge only a small plastic missile, whether it's also capable of discharging any other kinds of missile, is not capable of discharging a missile of any kind with a kinetic energy at the muzzle of the weapon that exceeds the permitted level. And then it defines what a small plastic missile is. It means a missile is wholly or partly made from plastics, is spherical, and does not exceed 8 millimeters in diameter. And then the stuff we're talking about...
That in itself was a fight, I believe.
Yeah, that was a battle.
Yeah,
that was the differentiate the 6mm and 8mm thing, because for a while there was an adamance that airsoft was 6mm, and that would have completely. And I mean, this doesn't even just touch sale of new versions of it, new products. This actually would roll back and impact people that already had 8mm airsoft guns. The effect of the law coming into play then would be if you've got an 8mm airsoft gun, it turns out to be potentially a Section 5 firearm. It's like, oh, well, we probably can't put that into law, can we?
Okay.
How is that going to be enforced?
So let's do the kinetic energy. So the permitted kinetic energy is, in the case of a weapon which is capable of discharging 2 or more missiles successively without repeated pressure on the trigger, that's burst or full auto, 1.3 joules. In any other case, so that's your semi-autos and your sniper and your bolt action springers and all that sort of stuff. You have to semi-auto and bolt actions for in colloquial terms, 2.5 joules. Now that's not necessary. That's the legal limits. There's also site limits which will vary depending on what site you go to. So I won't necessarily get too stressed about that at the moment. But this is interesting because this actually defines what an airsoft gun actually is. And prior to 2007, it didn't exist. It was just a thing.
Just very ethereal.
Gaz.
We're getting a couple of questions on YouTube, by the way. One regarding the manufacture of RIF when you turn it from a imitation firearm to a realistic imitation firearm. Manufacturer is covered as described as in the defences. If you can avail yourself of defence for import or to be sold to, you can also use that defence to turn a if into a RIF. Doing so otherwise is also covered in the law and is not allowed. So and
in layman's terms, Gaz, what does that mean? Does that mean painting your blue gun black?
If you paint your blue gun black and turn it from a legal imitation to a legal realistic imitation, and you do not have defence, you're breaking the law. If you do have defence, it's perfectly fine. Mm-hmm. Also, there's somebody there commenting on about being a UKARA member to do this. It's important for people to realise that you do not have to be a UKARA member to have defence. It is a way of people proving that you have defence away. Not
It's
the
probably
way.
the quickest, the most established, and even though people
the most
hate
secure.
on it, it's most secure and it's the smoothest way to prove that you can an entitlement to buy a RIF.
So
and I know people hate it, but it's actually done a lot of good for Airsoft as well.
It's made it bigger.
So, Phil, if I were to, I mean, this isn't all about beer, but if, let's say, Phil, you run a bar and you're selling alcoholic drinks to people, and I come to you and say, can I buy that pint of lager, please? Can I have 2 pints of lager? And you say, have you got any ID, mate? And I say, oh, well, actually, I've got this carved into stone that proves that I have a credit card with this bank that only accepts people that are over 18, and I've had this for 2 years. You'd say, it's not really ID that I really choose to trust, is it? I'd actually just quite like to see a passport, driving licence, provisional, something like that. And people don't get shitty about that, do they? People don't get funny about a barman saying, can you show me a valid form of ID?
Actually, they do. They really do, genuinely. But it's not something people write Facebook groups over.
No. Yeah. It's understood that your form of identification may not be accepted by that particular outlet.
Yeah, it's on you.
So people talk about... So we'll go. I've got some questions talking about UKARA specifically, but people get really, and we'll go into it in a bit more detail about what it actually is and what it actually isn't, because people get really confused all the time about what UKARA is. So we'll do a little section on it and what it means and what it actually is, because it's difficult. Right, I think you'll be really glad to know, guys, I'm pretty much at the end of the legislation section. It's only taken God. Who's jet washing?
It's my teenage son who's got one volume setting, which is just loud.
So I think some of the questions I've got coming up we've already covered, so we might have to. Would be great. So we'll skim through those. Something I just want to remind people of is I used 5 different documents to get all that stuff together. So 5 different documents. So three legal documents. So the VCRA, the Statutory Instrument, and the Firearms Act, and then 2 advisors and 2 documents which were basically advising chief police officers about how to implement it. So no wonder. So I'm going to point this out. No wonder people get totally confused over the law and the legislation, because it's spread out over so many different places. It's literally taken me 2-3 days to even get vaguely my head around it, and I'm still not completely sure.
Just want to go and shoot me mates in the woods, man.
Have you got insurance?
Hang on.
Right. Iron Hulk, we'll get onto that in a minute when we talk about UKARA, but yes, a very good point. Let's do it right now, because actually it's quite interesting, right? Let me just move this. Why can you buy 2 guns, one an airsoft and the other an air pistol, that look identical to each other, but the air pistol is a lot more powerful and requires no defence to buy?
Because it's lethal.
It's an air gun. Yeah.
It's not an imitation firearm. Well,
No,
it is
a firearm, isn't it?
It's a type of firearm. So
it has, as far as I understand it, it's because it has a purpose. Potentially, it has a purpose to hunt and or kill something, or to target shoot or something like that.
Not even that complicated, Ben. It's just because it is under a simply different piece of legislation. It's not an imitation of a firearm because it is a firearm. So therefore, it's not restricted.
An air weapon is a type of firearm, so it's not an imitation of one. It's as simple as that. I know it's mad. I know it makes no sense. It makes sense in legal terms, but in more practical sense, it
makes
doesn't make
no
any
common
sense. No, it's no common sense. But that's
the longer you look into it, probably the more sense it makes. I mean, as hobbyists, our initial reaction is to look at this law and go, "What a load of fucking crap that is! It's just stopping us from doing what we want to do." But then if you actually lift the lid on it and start delving in and looking at the exceptions and the different routes you could go down, it actually does kind of make sense. And I know this probably isn't going to be very popular with people watching the stream and things like that. We all tend to feel like we're being very restricted by the law. But again, going back to what Gaz said about the spirit of the restrictions and the spirit of the defence and things like that, it does kind of work. Albeit a bit shakily.
Yeah. And also, I don't think people realise that a lot of the semi-automatic air pistols that we now see as, they're easier to buy than airsoft pistols, up until 1997 were actually restricted firearms.
Okay.
You had to have them on a firearms ticket. And when they did the handgun ban, the sweetener was that they allowed CO2-powered semi-automatic pistols to come off the firearms ticket as air guns instead.
Yeah,
that's really interesting. Thanks for that, guys.
Yeah, it's Gadge. I thought it was Vin Diesel for a second then, but Gadge has just piped up in the Facebook comments and said, "Why do we need a defence for airsoft when you can buy a D-Axe? And also, why can't I buy a RIF when I have a shotgun licence?" And he's just said, "I think we've probably just covered off that question with the response that you just made there, Gaz. I think that's a good explanation."
But I understand why it's frustrating to people. One's a gun and one's not an imitation firearm because it's a D-Axe. D-Axe have their own set of legislation.
Easy way to think of it is really, really simply is it lethal and therefore is it a gun, right? And a D-Axe is still considered to be a gun. It's a legalised, deactivated, made safe, but still restricted gun.
Yeah.
Right?
It has to be done in prescribed fashion though, doesn't it? It can't just be you've bunged a bit of metal down the barrel. It's got to be very specifically deactivated.
Yes, and it's got more stringent with DX.
Yeah, a lot more stringent.
If it's non-lethal, but it still looks like a gun, it's specifically illegal, not a gun. So things that look like guns can either be guns or not a gun.
Not a gun.
And an airsoft, a realistic imitation firearm, specifically not a gun. So it can't be a gun and can't be treated as a gun, but it's treated as a realistic imitation of a gun.
Okay, Matt Lincoln he's kind of refreshed a question we previously had from Mike. I have my own public liability insurance that specifically covers airsoft skirmishing and target shooting. I believe that gives me personal defence. What do you chaps think? I'm not a lawyer, but by going by what I've just read out, I think you need to make your own mind up. Are you taking part in military law, in the acting out of military and law enforcement scenarios for the purposes of recreation, in a group of 2 or more people, does that group, not just the people, have public liability insurance? If you're not doing that, you're not doing airsoft. You don't.
Also,
that's the reality,
are you
guys.
Causing alarm to the general public? In which case, the police probably have enough authority to come along and say, "Doesn't matter what insurance you've got, mate. You've got to stop doing that because it's causing us grief and it's causing the public grief."
Okay, I'll do one more question
and go on.
from the audience.
Now
I'll bang through some of the stuff I've got listed. Sorry, guys, do you want to finish?
Yeah, I have known people who have actually had a small patch of private land and they have put public liability insurance on in order to organise small games there so that they could actually avail of the fence and also provide membership. And that's perfectly legal. However, it's not really viable because to put PLI on a site where you're going to have an event is not 70 quid a year or whatever. It's usually around £700 to £900 a year. I know because I have to pay it.
Yeah.
Or more, depending on where it is and where you fall and other risks involved. But if you have a patch of land and you insure it, it's not going to be as easy or cost effective as most defences are out there.
Okay.
Interestingly, Gaz, probably one to pick up on the back of that. What are you actually insuring against? What is
this trips a lot of people up, actually.
Yeah, third-party injury.
Yeah. People think that if they get hurt, they can sue you, which isn't the case.
It's to prevent you from being sued for someone else hurting someone else.
Yeah.
So it's not for falling over a branch or something like that and doing your ankle in.
No.
And
say,
not
for example,
being able to work.
If it's a woodland site and you know a tree's fallen over and it's dangerous and you leave it, then they can sue you because you knew there was a danger and you did nothing about it. If they trip over their own feet running around in the woods, land on a tree and break their arm, that's their own fault. They can't sue you for that. I think that's isn't it, Gaz?
But it's third-party liability. So your first party is the person with the insurance. The second party is the person taking part in your permitted activity. The third party is an injured party that is not part of your particular activity.
So for example, if Mrs. Miggins is walking her dog on a Sunday stroll and walks through your bit of woodland that you're playing your permitted activity of airsoft with your public liability insurance on, and she gets shot and injured, or scared.
PLA comes
That's where the PLA comes in. Okay, I'll do one more from the audience, and then we might do a couple of the questions I've got lined up. So Dan asks, do we know if anyone has been prosecuted over any of the legislation you've just spoke about?
Not to the best of my knowledge, although I've not been on that side of things for quite a while.
I've heard of a few. It doesn't tend to be on airsoft sites. It tends to be stuff like a bloke's taken his guns to his work car park in the back of his car to show his mates his cool collection, and Mrs. Miggins has walked past, been alarmed and called the arm response unit.
Damn this Mrs. Miggins.
But they usually prosecute under the Firearms Act for taking a...
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a good point. So that's imitation firearms.
I don't know anyone that's made it into public knowledge that's been prosecuted under the Violent Crime Reduction Act for subsection 3 for the re-estimation bit. The knife bit is being prosecuted every single day of the week.
Do you think that's because there is no airsoft activity taking place? Showing somebody your crap in the back of a car in a car park is not an airsoft activity, is it? So it's kind of built in our favour still.
I imagine if someone buys a blue gun, sprays it black and holds up a bank, right, then that's another thing they can slap them with.
And it's the same with the PCA. It's essentially the Policing and Crime Act was made to be another nail in someone's coffin when they're doing something really bad. And I've said this for years now, is that as an airsofter, you should never, ever, ever find yourself in a position where you actually get charged under either the Violent Crime Reduction Act or under the Policing and Crime Act, because no one is actually out to get airsofters, right?
I'm really glad you said that, guys.
Get rid of it, because unless you're doing something that's already illegal, i.e. you're robbing a bank, you're going to go and mug someone, or you're doing something really stupid, then generally speaking, someone is not going to try and nail you for airsofting. However, break into property, if you do armed trespass to go and play at Land Warrior's site, I know Scottish law is different, but trespass is a civil offence. As soon as you have something that's deemed to be a weapon, it's armed trespass. It's a criminal offence.
So what you're saying is there is generally an overriding law in place that has more serious consequences than being an airsofter. So unless you're being an absolute twat, for want of a better word, you're going to be okay. If you are acting with the best intentions, according to all the guidelines that you've given, that you can probably read on any given Facebook group going by somebody that you can trust rather than somebody just commenting in passing, you're probably going to be all right. Unless you actually are out to go and commit a crime.
In which case the airsoft part is the smallest infraction.
Yeah.
And this is what we said when they introduced these things, was we were like, what's it for? And the answer was things like, well, if someone commits armed robbery we were like, well, they're already committing armed robbery and they're already committing a firearms offence. What do they need? What does it matter that it's a risk limitation?
It's pretty much like pulling Pablo Escobar with eight tons of cocaine in the back of a truck over and then doing him because one of his tyres is a little bit bald.
However, what we don't want is undue attention.
Exactly.
This is true.
So a caveat to all the stuff the guys have just said, which I completely agree with, is that Airsoft does not want attention from the Home Office. A large part, and we'll go into this. We'll go into some questions now. A large part of what the Home Office wanted us to do was to self-police. Very much did not. It's like, if we have to do this for you, you do not want us to do this for you. We'll take it away. We'll take it away. Okay.
The batteries are coming out the toy.
So let's do a few formal ones, and then we'll try and grab some more questions from the audience, because thanks for your questions, guys. Do put them in. I'll make a note of them, or one of the other guys will make a note of them, and we'll cover them. Okay. So I know we've got a load of people with us who never played Airsoft before the VCRA. So let's just do. Can we just do kind of a couple of minutes on what Airsoft? I mean, we touched on it right at the beginning, but I know we've got some newer people joining us. Let's just talk about what Airsoft was like before the VCRA. Who wants to lead it?
If you think it's niche now, you should have tried it 15 years ago. Where literally, if 15 people turned up to a site, you didn't know what to do with that many players, and everybody knew. Yeah, everybody knew everybody, and if you cheated, if you did something, the old adage, don't be a dick. If you were a dick, you didn't play Airsoft again.
Absolutely, because you didn't get invited back. because everything was by invite.
Yeah.
So you didn't go and find the local Facebook group and then find out about Airsoft and ask dumb questions that have been asked over and over. For a start, if you did find an online forum and you asked a dumb question that's been asked twice that week, you were pretty much out of that forum. Never.
Yeah.
So to stress, this was pre-Facebook. It was pre-YouTube. It was certainly pre-Insta and the rest of it. Social media was basically online forums. Okay.
Yeah. And you could maybe have a selection of 3 different rifles, perhaps a FAMAS, an M4 that I know isn't an M4, but I'm just going to say that.
I remember poring over the Marui.
You had to change batteries almost as often as the mags because there were 600 milliamp Sanyo NiCads that would last maybe 300 BPs.
Yeah.
Where's those rose-tinted glasses that I was talking about earlier?
I know, come on.
Okay, so
days, eh?
I've got
for goalposts.
I found a line. I found a line in some of the Home Office minutes. This was the stakeholders you talked about, Gaz, talking to the Home Office, and it says 20 dedicated airsoft retailers, 100 sites, and 10,000 players. And as you say, that's probably inflated for the purposes of.
It was, I think.
Yeah.
some rounding errors. Yeah, just some rounding errors.
Yeah, it's all to do with the rounding. Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about how the VCRA came about. It was largely to, as Gaz just said, to slap some extra offences on. It was also a big headline public order.
It was like stop knife crime, public disorder, drinking, things like that. You know, things that are just generally dickish.
But most of the legislation already existed somewhere else.
It was a big PR exercise in a way.
To be fair, there were I think there were something like 3,000 offences involving what would then be replicate imitation firearms. Though I believe the majority of those were committed by 13-year-olds on other 13-year-olds. Yeah. But anyway, so Phil, do you want to talk about UKAPU briefly?
Yeah, sure.
I think it's really important, and people need to join it. It doesn't. Or you can go into that.
It's free to join, so yeah, I think it's definitely worth doing. And as Gaz alluded to earlier, when the VCRB was, knocking around in the early days, there was no Players Association, and it wasn't for the want of trying. Quite a few people had tried to set up a Players Association previously, and for one reason or another, they always failed. They never got any traction. But Gaz was there with me. I think there's 13 of us. There's 15 in total, I think, of us, wasn't there? In that working man's club in Birmingham one evening.
Yeah.
UKAPU was born. Matt Fury King was the first chairman, and he was like the driving force behind it. But Ken Elston, who owned Fireball Squadron at the time, who I've known for over 20 years now, helped an awful lot with the wording of the letters of association and so on, and what it was to do. But in essence, it was set up that, we had the UKARA for the retailers, there was the UKASGB for the sites, but there was no representation for players. And that's what UKAPU, and the reason it was UKAPU was because there had been UK Airsoft Players Association. In fact, up until about 3 years ago, I still owned the URL for that, and I just let it lapse. But it was UKAPU Union. It was the Players Association, but it was just to give it something of a different nomenclature so that it didn't get confused with things that had happened in the past. And the whole idea was, join it as a member, you would have the weight of the organisation behind you, and it did an awful lot of good. I mean, I know it was represented at Home Office meetings, and I don't know if it got stakeholder status or not. Gaz could probably confirm that better than I can.
They are listened to.
Yeah, but they would certainly listen to, and it did really show, that there was a unified body of players, and since its inception, and due credit where it's due, it's still going. It might not be as active as it once was, and I was lucky to be chairman myself for 18 months, and I work full time, but I would get 10, 15 calls a day, emails from players who were having issues either importing RIFs, with UK Border Agency as it was then, or issues with like say police had been round and confiscated all their riffs because Mrs. Miggins had seen them playing in the garden. Damn that Mrs. Miggins! She's like the Carol Baskins to Airsoft.
I should probably do a t-shirt. I'll do a t-shirt with Mrs. Miggins on as well.
Yeah.
Watch out.
I was looking into it the other day. Mrs. Miggins does actually have a name under UK law, and it is the man on the Clapham omnibus. He is who all UK law is written as the kind of onlooker, and he is neither an expert nor an idiot, which is quite interesting.
Yeah. That's cool.
It's slightly it's slightly different to a layman. Actually, I got caught out with it because I was layman's what you use. Apparently, it isn't. It's slightly different, but he is this fictional character, and it's weird that a lot of the UK law that we work with is kind of written for a fictional character. So
man on the street.
Yeah, we were kind of talking about the law enforcement and military reenactment and things like that. And obviously we've been speaking about this stream over the last couple of weeks and kind of batting around ideas that we'll be talking about. I don't know if we need to go on to that yet, do we, Tom? Or...
I have a question on it, so we'll definitely be covering it. So let's let Phil kind of. Can you just brief Phil? Can you just give us a minute on what UKAPU does and can do for people?
Well, UKAPU is there to represent the players in the purest form and shortest way of putting it. That's its raison d'etre. That's why it was formed. It was to give players a unified voice. There's thousands of players in the UK now in fragmented little groups and Facebook groups or internet groups, whatever. But this is to give a one voice almost, like UKARA does for the retailers to represent players. So if there ever was, it was formed out of a necessity to have a voice, to present a unified front. And I still think it's valid today because there are always things that happen. Not too long ago, the gun trade. It definitely is. It definitely is more now than ever, really.
I think it's been quite firmly stated by UKARA that UKARA has neither the time nor the capacity to be a police force or an advisory board.
Although everybody believes that the UKARA is the police or has its own police.
Right. So that's a great time. Let's. What is UKARA? We've kind of touched on it. Let's just get it out there. What is UKARA? What does it do?
UK Retailers Airsoft Retailers.
It's not a license.
UK Airsoft Retailers Association. So it's basically a group of retailers who pay for the UKARA database of players. It's nothing more. It's not a lobbying party. They've stated they don't lobby, they don't do this, they don't do that. That's not what they're about anymore. It's purely a database now.
Yeah.
It wasn't to start with, but that's what it became. We don't know exactly when it became that, because at some point the big three decided it was that way.
Yeah.
But it's just a database. So I think the things to remember is that UKARA don't actually have a say in anything that you do, so you don't have to worry about that. UKARA doesn't say anything about products in that come into UK or anything like that, because airsoft retailers agree less than airsoft players do. That's the secret of airsoft, is that retailers do not agree on anything. So they couldn't organise to overrule any airsoft players because they wouldn't agree with each other. The database is free. That's one big thing that I see all the time, is people saying UKARA costs money. UKARA is free for players. The only people that pay for UKARA are the retailers.
It is worth saying, though, guys, some sites may charge an admin fee for doing your card. Sorry.
The sites can charge you your membership that then gets put on the UKARA database. You are not a UKARA member. We say UKARA membership because it's easy, but in actual fact, you're not a UKARA member ever. The only UKARA members are retailers. Okay. When you get put in the database, it's your site membership to whatever site you go to that is put onto the database. So your membership is with, I don't know, First and Only or Z Adventures or whoever it is that you go and play with.
You can tell this, can't you, Gaz, because of the structure of the UKARA number that you're given. It's appended with a prefixed with a
your site. Yeah, and then your last 5 numbers are your membership number. So that doesn't cost money for you. Your membership fees, if you get any, are for your site, and it's your site that manages your access to the database.
And a lot of people complain that there's a fee associated with doing this, but it does take the people that operate sites time and effort to go through this process and deal with all the questions that they get given, because they're probably just trying to have a cup of tea after a game day and they're getting bombarded by questions. So, a lot of people criticise it and things like that. But this guy who's doing it is dealing with your question outside of his working hours necessarily.
Yeah. Making membership cards as well.
Originally, we're talking only about 6 years ago now. Sites didn't generally put their own people on. You went to your site, you got your membership, they filled out the UKARA form and then stamped it, and then you took that to a retailer, and the retailer actually had to sit and put it on a database. And then later on, the sites do it. And the reason that this happened is because there was quite often a delay with the site batching up all their membership forms to post off, or if you were sending yourself, the shops having to sit there for an hour or 3 going through all the forms they've been given in. They've paid for the database, and they're paying someone to sit there and put it on the database, because ultimately it's to sell to the player. But
how dare a poor bastard make money from doing something that costs them money? The Airsoft's never been a charitable organisation, and very few people put games on purely out of the goodness of their own heart. I know some people do, but at the end of the day, you want to cover your own costs. You don't want to be paying for everybody, and I don't think anybody in the airsoft industry should be vilified for trying to cover their time and expenses and maybe make themselves to go out for a couple of beers or something afterwards. There's no crime in that, and we definitely should not, kind of hammer people for trying to make a couple of quid for himself in the weekend.
No. And also, you've got to bear in mind there wouldn't be Airsoft in the UK. Certainly now there wouldn't be Airsoft in the UK if it wasn't for people who are actually making money from it. Because if people weren't making money from it in 2005, there
wouldn't be a stakeholder, would you?
And there wouldn't be Airsoft. So
there wouldn't be any Airsoft, no.
And now you need products, and the only people that can really do that in any kind of bulk really is larger retailers, or wholesale.
I think, if I may, just before we move on, Tom, just say that with the PCA, it was really nice to see how UKARA and UKAPU actually kind of worked together in a way. It was really quite collaborative, and that's something that I'm sure you guys have. It's not something you see very often.
That's rare.
Cool. That kind of covers off some of the stuff.
It was really nice to see, because UKARA's probably got the funding in place to do it. And I know that the money gets paid into an account, obviously, and UKAPU's got the time and the people resources to lobby.
Yeah.
So it's a really nice synergy.
Funny enough, you should say that as well, Phil. There was a slightly later European kind of incident that came along where Airsoft may be banned on a kind of EU level, and God, let me say EU on the internet, somebody's probably going to shit their kidney out or something like that. But actually, quite a few members of the industry, I know ASG, Umarex, and Cybergun were involved, but they actually kind of allied together to form a kind of business fighting force to help prevent a sweeping European law from outlawing airsoft guns throughout Europe. And it was, again, like you say, UKAPU and UKARA coming together. Actually, 3 of the biggest businesses within airsoft in Europe formed together and actually took that fight. A lot of people probably never even heard about that and didn't really know that it was occurring. But it did. It happened behind the scenes, and conferences were had, and talking was done, and it was eventually brushed away, and Airsoft was allowed to once again sidestep sweeping legislation that may catastrophically impact the hobby and sale of airsoft guns throughout the whole of Europe. And it kind of happened, and people don't make a fuss about it because people don't really care about it. It doesn't hit them at home. But again, great example of a unity within Airsoft.
It can happen.
Yeah, it did.
Okay, cool, guys. Let's just reiterate a couple of points. So, do I need to be UKARA registered to buy or own an airsoft gun?
No.
You don't need to be anything to own one. That's the first thing.
Yep.
To buy one, you need to be able to avail yourself of defence. How you do that is another matter.
Yep. Okay. And we've discussed at length previously what the defence we operate actually is.
Is the actual retailer that you are purchasing from, they are at liberty to request a defence that satisfies them.
They have
not
to.
you.
Yeah.
You're not in a position to stand there shouting about what defence you have and demand that the retailer sell you something.
And one thing that you need to be aware of with that is that there's a lot of people try to use the reenactment exemption stroke defence, and a lot of retailers won't accept that. And for the main reason being is when you're using it's hard to prove a lot of the time. It's also hard to prove what period you actually do, because the reenactment defence actually specifically says for the period for the purposes of the historical reenactment, and if you're buying the latest FN 2000, it's very hard to prove that you're like using that for historical purposes.
Again,
and the MVT, is it Motor Vehicle Trust or something like that, whatever they are, that sit at like War and Peace show telling you while you're at the show that if you buy this membership for £20 a year, you can buy whatever gun you like, especially at the show. If you go on their website, it specifically says this does not entitle you to the defence under the Violent Crime Reduction Act.
Yeah.
So,
Gaz,
don't
as
when you go to use it.
Your experience as a retailer, I know you don't do quite so much of that anymore, but your experience as a retailer, to make an analogy, it's not about somebody coming to you with a birthday card saying 18 today, love from Nan, and say, look, there's my defence, I'm 18. And you can say, I'm not really accepting that. Not comfortable accepting that, because I don't want you to be a sting from Channel 4 that's going to then lift the lid. I'm pretty sure this actually happened. Somebody tried to buy an airsoft gun using a spurious defence, and thankfully it didn't have to.
There was an alternate scheme that was set up quite a few years ago. I don't know if it's still going back or something. And somebody created an entirely false profile with a photo from some photo stock image, and they used it to buy a riff, or they tried to buy a riff. And I think they then said, actually, this is all bollocks. It's all made up. And they didn't check any of it.
But they used it to get British Airsoft Club membership, which allowed them to buy. And the British Airsoft Club was claiming that they were checking every defence, and they weren't checking it. So ultimately, being in a retailer at the time, we're not using British Airsoft Club. There was another scheme, the UKASA, that I won't go into the depths of it, but that's complete utter con. And again, we wouldn't have accepted
much like British Airsoft Club, to be honest, yes.
Well, that was a con.
Not being around the bush, it was just a manner of trying to get money out.
Secretive about their, because they were saying they were not for profit. So when I asked them when they were starting, what's your break-even point then? What point, and what are you going to do with any profits that you make? And then they refused to engage with me after that.
Interestingly, they were actually a retailer as well.
It was a single retailer.
Apocalypse Airsoft.
Yeah. It was a bit of a sketchy setup, and it didn't. It's not here now, is it? So to be as nice as possible about it, as diplomatic as possible.
I think it's still around.
I don't think it's gone completely. No,
it hasn't gone
completely. I think some places it will accept the card.
A few people have got laminated cards.
So we're on that subject. Steve Pearsall from Facebook. Can British Association for Shooting and Conservation membership and the public liability insurance that comes with that be used as a valid defence to purchase an airsoft gun, RIF, and use them on private sites? No, unless they're doing what we've already talked about. The acting out of law enforcement military scenarios for the purposes of recreation, two or more people, one of which holds public liability insurance.
Yeah.
That's the defence. If you ain't doing that, you don't have a defence.
At the shooting show several years ago, the number of guys who were walking around who'd just bought a new over and under shotgun, and then they were disgusted that they couldn't buy the little Beretta pistol they'd just been playing with on the stand, even though it was a toy, and they've got firearms and shotgun certificates. They couldn't believe it.
The worst show to ever work at. I did it 3 years
ago. It was horrible, yeah.
But then comes the awkward side of it, and just to play the counterpoint here, we have no definition of what a military or law enforcement scenario for recreation is.
Right, so let's go into that. Let's go into that now.
Also, sorry, Tim. Before we do, as a retailer, you were saying about like when I was retailing, the onus is on me, right? So when a player comes in and says they want to buy, I don't know, a pistol or a rifle, it's not them that's going to get prosecuted for starters. Mm-hmm. It's going to be me personally, not the retailer. It's the person that gets done, not the shop. Okay, so it's up to me. In fact, it even states so. I have to make sure that I am confident and without reasonable doubt that the person who is purchasing can avail themselves of defence. So I've used UKARA. That's really easy. I just go on a database, type it in, watch your postcode. There we go. It matches. That's fine. I can use site membership card if they're in person, because I can ring up the site and go, "Has this person still got membership? Is it still valid? You know, is this card actually worth anything, or do they print it off on their Hewlett Packard?" Or I can, if I'm at, this is a real controversial one. Several years ago, people kicked up a big stink because a certain retailer was selling guns to first-time players on a site at an event. I hate to tell you, that's allowed.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, because they're there playing.
You can prove that this person I am selling to, sorry, Kat, it's going to be you. So my cat wants to buy this, and we're at an airsoft event, and I go, "Are you going to use it now?" And they go, "Yeah." I go, "Okay, do I sell it?" As long as they're over 18. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That is a perfectly legitimate sale, because I can actually prove that they are going to use it for that.
Yeah.
Because it's for the purposes of.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure the Home Office. Not sure that was the intent that the Home Office had. Yeah, However, that's not what's written in law.
This is the backlash against it, isn't it?
Yeah.
The whole point is basically, because we're supposed to be self-policing, if we start to be as lax as possible with our self-policing, and it comes around to bite us in the arse, there's always the caveat in place where they can say, "You're self-policing, shit. You're not allowed to do it anymore."
Yeah, and also sites tend to be a little bit more careful about who they grant membership to and things like that as well, because they. Yeah. I mean, I've worked at big sites, and we've had people turn up, and before the briefing is over, we've gone, they're not going to make it through the first game, let alone the day, and we never want them back. Yeah. Right?
Wouldn't trust them with a duster, let alone a riff.
We honestly, some people you go, they are not, and you definitely. They're not going to be one of the people where you let them into your site shop and go, "Yeah, go and buy this now." But the other thing is that generally, if someone is buying a realistic imitation firearm to commit a crime, they're not spending £400 on an AEG, right?
No.
They're buying a pistol and spraying it black.
Exactly.
So, and as we talked about, none of this legislation was intended to catch legitimate airsofters. That was never the point. We just got caught up with it. Okay, I think we could go on about various defence schemes or not for a while, but I think before we finish, one thing I do want to talk about, whether we have and this is very much going to be an opinion because I'm not sure it's ever been defined, was what Ben was talking about, do we have any idea what does the acting out of military and law enforcement scenarios for the purposes of recreation actually mean?
I guess if you say, right, we're holding a Black Hawk Down themed day, that would be a very definite description. It's reenacting a very specific military engagement that happened, is well documented, and as long as the good guys win in the same way, then you are reenacting.
Well, it doesn't have to. It's acting out, so it's not. Yeah. It's very specifically not reenacting. Yeah. Very specifically not reenacting.
Does it say enacting or recreate or reenacting?
It says acting out. Acting out. Yeah. Military and law enforcement scenarios for the purpose of recreation. The recreation's interesting because that doesn't say competition to me. That's a whole other big.
Well, that's a whole other topic, isn't it?
Though it's vague, it's actually very specific as well.
Yeah.
Because you can honestly go, is this a law enforcement or military scenario? Am I realistically portraying a police or law enforcement scenario? And if you're not, then you've got no defence. Yeah. That's simple. I mean, competition shooters doesn't matter. I know Ben's been involved with IPSC. A lot of people I know that are very, very involved with IPSC.
Very barely. Very barely. Let's just say that at this point.
they can't avail themselves of the defence to buy a pistol. But it doesn't matter to them because they want bright blue and they want bright red and they want two-tone, this, that and the other. Because it's all part of their sport where they try and even the real pistols are so bright because they try and disassociate themselves with weapons to the point where they make everything bright coloured and just like an imitation firearm.
That said, though, Gaz, the roots of such sports and the roots of the competition are for law enforcement and military training.
They were, but when they stopped shooting at human-shaped targets, they stopped being for law enforcement.
So far removed from that now, though. Yeah, they're using very specific IPSC targets that aren't like figure 11s or...
IDPA is still for defensive purposes. That's defensive practical pistol. Yeah. Right. Yeah. That is specifically for acting out scenarios of being in a defensive scenario in your house, in your car, on duty, whatever. Yeah.
So like action air, like practical action air, where you like maybe 3-gun and you're running not like just you've got man-shaped targets that you've got to knock down and various things like that. That's more still law enforcement-ish than
in my opinion, and this may be controversial. It's not. All they would need to do is say we're Dallas SWAT doing a training day in the safety brief.
Yeah.
Simple as that, but they don't.
Shall we stop beating around the bush?
Is Speedsoft?
Do you think Speedsoft valid?
Speedsoft is an abomination that should be burnt to stake, along with all the guns that go with it.
No, but Phil, take that away from your personal view.
I'm going to be fair and say Speedsoft is valid as a sport of Speedsoft.
Yeah.
Sport.
Yes.
Yeah. Airsoft isn't a sport. That's another thing that people say. Airsoft's a sport. It isn't. It doesn't hit any of the classifications for Sport UK.
Correct.
To be classed as a sport.
However, while Speedsoft is a completely valid sport, it's not under the description of Airsoft as legally termed for UK, and therefore is not part of our defence.
So to follow on from that, does Speedsoft require a defence?
No.
If they use
bright colours,
if they use brightly coloured imitation firearms,
when you
doesn't matter.
Some of the god-awful guns that don't look like a gun, and they use them to go and play in the woods for a military simulation, and then people go, oh, just let them use whatever they want. What does it matter? You're just being a snob. It's like, these are the guys who never had any experience of airsoft pre-2007. They don't realise, the suspension of disbelief was a key argument in keeping RIFs for airsoft skirmishing.
It was, but unfortunately that's not really being recorded.
It
does say it is an intrinsic part of airsoft skirmishing. So it's still there in the notes.
Personally, I've spoken about it on previous streams, and we've talked about it over and over and over again. My personal tastes for airsoft are very much basically around making models of guns and the particular, fairly stringent reenactment of military law enforcement scenarios. That's what I like. However, it's not just because I work for an airsoft sales company, but it's also because I'm trying to be a little bit more open-minded about things before I become a belligerent middle-aged man.
Too late for me.
Speedsoft. I've played a little bit of Speedsoft. I actually really quite enjoyed it. It was fun to play as a different sport. I mean, personally, for me, I would love to see Speedsoft do a little bit more like that sort of IDPA kind of stuff, where you use the strengths of airsoft rather than just playing paint. I think Speedsoft is probably better as paintball. Like speedball or whatever they call it.
Yeah.
If you're going to take that into an airsoft sphere, I would rather see people use 3 30-round mags and a pistol with a spare mag, and 5-on-5 in a realistic scenario, kind of maybe a building complex,
a kill house, and
use the strengths of airsoft like that.
And there are some competitions like that. I think G&G do one.
Shooting. There's dynamic action shooting by PTS. Interestingly, none of these non-military or police forms of airsoft existed prior to the VCRA.
They didn't, did they?
It's a very UK-centric argument. In the States, none of this matters.
No.
So if we have any viewers, I
Lots
know
of
I've
places.
got viewers from other countries. This discussion is very pertinent to the UK.
Yeah.
Most other countries,
then
this flies
also-
completely under the radar.
Airsoft is very new in the US, and it's also restricted mainly to youngsters because they have a wider firearms industry, as it were, that people are interested in, a more hobbyist industry for firearms. But yeah, with the UK stuff is that the only reason why the exemption exists under the VCRA was because we argued that we required realistic imitation firearms. Yeah. And this is why immediately after, and this is going to be a real sore point.
That's my next question, so go for it.
Immediately after we won the defence, 2 retailers went ahead and told the Home Office that they were quite willing to bring in non-realistic ones for profit, which completely undermined our defence. We'd have lost it as soon as...
Poor Andy Stevens got absolutely ripped apart for doing that at his sites. Can you remember playing at the sandpit?
He banned 2 tones.
UCAP sandpit. And he actually made quite a pertinent point when you were in his brief. I mean, it all went to rat shit on the internet. But his point was, you kind of don't really need a 2-tone, so I'm not going to allow 2 tones on my site. If you want to come along, hire a gun for the period that you need to hire a gun, and then buy a proper one, and then come and play real airsoft.
He actually, he did a scheme, didn't he? And various other things since then, but he did a scheme where you could buy a gun. You'd have the same gun each time you went to play.
Yeah,
and then after the
layaway
third game, you got to take it away with you. But
you
until then,
paid for it, you hired it in stages until you could take it.
Exactly. Which I thought was actually quite a good idea.
I know the poor guy got absolutely ripped apart for saying that you weren't allowed to use 2 tones on his site.
I was 100% with him on that.
Yeah, his point that it undermines everything that we're supposed to have was something I
Blood,
can
sweat,
only agree
tears,
with.
and thousands of pounds were spent making sure we could play with realistic imitation firearms.
It was.
And then, boom, here you go. Here's your pink M4 or AK. Have fun.
You're all having great fun, aren't you?
On that note, is that some of those same people that fought to get those imitation firearms, went to the manufacturers to get those imitation firearms brought in, are also the ones that decided that that's not realistic enough now, and they offer 2 tones in a green camouflage, like COD-esque camouflage, which is certainly not in the spirit of the way it's written.
They're supposed to be, they're very specific.
It could be argued that was a military and law enforcement scenario for that man on the Clapham omnibus, because for him, Call of Duty is a military or law enforcement scenario, which is where we get into a dirty area.
When you see police and military units using simunition, they have blue handguards and blue stocks and blue pistol grips quite often.
That's a firearm, so it doesn't count.
I know, but you could say that you're reenacting their training.
And also,
we're reenacting their reenacting.
Yeah.
It makes blue a riff.
A riff, then, because it's actually,
So it turns into a riff, so it's not an imitation firearm, it's
simunition, but it fires
as Gaz says, it's actually covered.
There's a meme for this, isn't there? Mind blown.
Yeah.
So it means that you've just taken one of the 5 permitted colours for an imitation firearm is now gone because it's taken it off the table, because using it makes it look too much like a firearm. I'm going to have to plug a charger.
So we just need to get police forces to deck the other colours on their guns, and then we can get rid of them completely.
So, I know, joking aside, do you think 2 tones allow airsoft to be bigger or better or contribute anything to airsoft?
It makes it more accessible, but I'm not sure I like that anyway.
Well, they contribute to bringing more people in that don't have to earn their way in.
Yeah. Airsoft is, let's face it, I mean, I bet if we added up between us how much we've spent on airsoft kit in the last 30 years, we could probably buy a house.
Can I just turn the internet off in the house so Jody can have stream drops out briefly?
Yeah. Luckily, I'm on my own, and I know in 28 years I've spent over 40 grand easily on airsoft. It's an expensive hobby. It just is, people turn up to a motor race going, I really want to race cars, but I can only afford a Ford Escort. Well, you can't play that. You can't join in. because you haven't got the right equipment. But I want to.
I think there's a bigger stream we can probably all get together again. Actually, which would be quite interesting. We're working on the themes we're talking about now, about accessibility, about how it's changed, about COD, about scenarios, and about that kind of stuff. I think that we could probably waffle on for an hour. I'm kind of conscious we've already been going for an hour and 42, so I'm gonna kind of work towards rolling it.
Spiked quite a lot as soon as we mentioned Speedsoft.
It's probably been shared on loads of Speedsoft forums, and everyone's got
Look
excited.
at these old tossers wearing their multicam, thinking they're in the army.
I can might operate a
My
t-shirt.
Clearwater page is just going to crash. Everybody's going to stop following it now, aren't they?
One thing about the Policing and Crime Act, I think that does confuse people, by the way, and I think it's something we definitely need to look at, is you gave the terms for what is a select fire stroke automatic weapon and the single shot semi-automatic weapon being different power levels. I think it's very important to note that otherwise in the firearms law, not in the PCA, the Firearms Act dictates what a semi-automatic and single firearm is, and it must be manufactured as such.
Yeah.
Yes, converting to a...
Yeah, you can't take a full automatic manufactured weapon and make it semi... Well, you can, but it's always going to be treated by law as if it was automatic. So this is where a lot of people are potentially able to get themselves in trouble, because they take an M16 that's full automatic when it comes into the country, and they make it semi-auto, and they bump it up to above 1.3 joules, and that is essentially taking it beyond the permissible levels for a still that will always be legally treated as a select fire weapon. It has to be manufactured as being a semi-automatic only weapon to start with.
It's a little bit grey, but reading through it, yes, I to an extent, I absolutely agree. And then there is, it's never, again, it's one of those things, until it goes to a judge, we're never really going to know. But potentially, you've just made a Section 5 firearm. And a Section 5 firearm is bad news.
I don't
want to be a tasker. Yeah.
I think we were discussing this obviously before, and what you have made is not stated. So you can't say you've made a Section 5 firearm because it doesn't fall into the bracket of Section 5 firearm as yet.
Someone needs to decide at some point, Yeah,
but what you have made is an illegal non-firearm.
Yeah. But no one's quite worked out what the illegal bit is yet. But but you do not want to be the test case. That is not a good place to be.
I'm not going to say I told you so on this one, but the law symposium that I attended back in the day, back when the PCA was going through, I stood up in the middle of this law symposium. There were a lot of police. There was Adrian Whiting, the guy that was fighting the case for UKARA, that was helping do the testing on lethality. I mean, we've spoken about lethality quite a lot as well, and I'll just cover that really quickly. In a legal sense, lethality is breaking a couple of layers of skin and not causing anything sort of trivial. It doesn't mean making something die. It actually means causing a superficial injury.
Ben, I found today in a minute from a chairman of a Home Office meeting. The chairman stressed that it was a strict test in order to set a muzzle energy above which a child could be killed if an artery near the surface of a child's skin was hit. So it's a very extreme case, and it's a very strict case. So that was the definition.
That would be a true worst case scenario, I imagine.
Yeah.
So we went to this law symposium, and there was a lot of talk about it. And my initial reaction at the point was, if you start differentiating with airsoft guns, a huge difference between full auto and single shot, you're going to run into a grey area. There's a big grey area in between, because with AEGs, the default setting, if something doesn't work quite right, you get full auto, or more than 2 successive shots with 1 trigger pull. So you start to break the law, even if the gun is designed in such a way. So my argument at the point was, can we just set an upper limit of 2.3 or 2.5 joules for everything? Because the likelihood of somebody focusing more than 1 shot with a full auto gun over any distance and not being able to cock a single action gun several times in the same succession to intentionally cause that harm is so slim, we're just basically backing ourselves into a corner with it and creating further admin and creating another big grey area. Just say 2.5 is the upper limit for airsoft. To be fair, most airsoft guns will break AEGs will break if you push them over 2 joules. They just can't cope with being used at that power level. And my statement was, I've played airsoft at this point for probably nearly a decade. I've been shot from every conceivable angle, from every conceivable distance, on every conceivable part of my body, and I'm yet to suffer any ill effects from perceived lethality. Can we just use the limits that we've tried and tested for the last few years, the last decade, at airsoft sites around the country? We've already done the work for you. We already know that 500 FPS with a sniper rifle is about as much as anybody wants to play with. Nobody really wants to play with anymore. And nobody wants a full auto gun to go a great deal higher than 375 to 400 FPS. Nobody really wants to be battered in the face by a DMR that you can buy 5 shots in the air at 450 FPS. We've done the work for you. Blanket ban it at 2.3 joules, 2.5 joules, or whatever you want. And then anything above that is an illegal weapon. Anything below that is already self-regulated within airsoft. And we won't need to change anything because we've already got limits in place to stop that gun that you've built from being used anywhere on people, unless you want to go and commit a firearms offence and shoot people.
Just to add to that, though, as well, that having that upper limit, I think it's also fair to say most sites set their limits below that.
Yeah, we always have done.
You couldn't play with a gun at that level anyway.
Yeah.
So most UK sites are around 350 FPS for full auto, aren't they? Some a little bit lower, some a bit higher.
The only exception to that would be that some events allow light machine guns up to 400 before, if they were like mounted machines and things like that. But
again, that would still be below the threshold of the upper limit of 2.5 joules.
But it's above the legal limit.
Now.
It's above the legal limit now. But if we went with Ben's idea of having the upper threshold, most sites would operate below that anyway.
Exactly.
Do you know the most ridiculous thing about it all is the lethality side of things? Do you know how many joules throwing your average AEG at somebody at over 6 foot is? It's
a lot more than 1.3.
16 joules.
The other thing that came from that, of course, was the fact they actually never, and they still haven't to this day, told us what the testing strategy was going to be in the event they were actually going to test. And they've still not told us whether we can import with the intention of downgrading them. They've just, after they brought it in, they just went, don't worry about it.
I'm not sure if Tom's ever actually found it on his adventure, but I seem to remember there being a Home Office memorandum going around that said something along the lines of, we have no intention of enforcing this law. Yeah, you are free to self-police it. However, if we have to, I'm paraphrasing massively here. However, if we're called upon to enforce it, you may well find yourself at the full extent of what we can enforce.
That was pretty much the notes that we got from them, to be fair.
I've not found it. It's probably in a minute somewhere. But looking at, I think one of the things I want to go back to is the intent of the laws that we have seem quite clear. And I know this will sound controversial. Actually seem quite sensible to a large extent as well. They really do, and it gives the, I've said this before, it gives the judiciary and the police a lot of discretion. If they need to use something, they have the power to do so. If they don't, you'll get a sort your life out, son, move on.
So the problem was there was an individual that went around the UK airsoft scene a few years ago causing problems, and I believe they did actually try to press charges against somebody for assault for shooting them with an airsoft gun. And I was really worried about the precedent that would set in court, because, if that would actually fundamentally make airsoft not viable to play, because if somebody didn't like what you were doing, or they'd called hit or something like that, they could actually turn around and say, right, you've assaulted me, I'm now going to stop it. And the insurance companies were like, I'm not covering that bunch of crap, because it's just going to become a cesspit of legislation. I'm not even going to bother trying. A hot gun. You shoot somebody with a hot gun, 2 or 3 FPS over the limit, it's assault. It's not practical.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys actually realised that there was actually a piece of legislation that affected airsoft before the VCRB was introduced many, many years ago, and I'm sure those guys will certainly remember it. The Brocock ban.
Yeah.
Do you remember the Brocock? Do you remember the wording of the Brocock ban? The wording of the Brocock ban accidentally caught Tanaka shell-fed rifles and Moscats. And when
Tanaka released the Cassiopeia system, didn't they? And then they had to.
Yeah.
How does
they got banned in Japan.
How does the APS shotgun shell work?
Well, that would be exactly the same law as the Moscat shell. It was captured in the whole thing because it was a self-contained cartridge that held the ammunition and the gas and the propellant. Yeah. And when it was actually flagged up, they went, "We don't mean you." That was literally the "We don't mean you."
So technically they're illegal, but they're not worried about it.
That's become sort of a recurring theme, hasn't it, over the whole period of legislation? Like,
shut up, you guys.
Sorry, not you. Just carry on.
So let's get Gaz to talk.
They changed the wording of that piece of legislation specifically to name Brocock.
Okay, right. Okay, so they're specifically named. Yes, and actually, if you look at it, they specifically named certain types.
So we've actually had a question about APS shotguns on YouTube. Someone was saying whether APS shotguns fall. Essentially, it's the same as a Moscat shell in that it's still limited. It's a single-shot weapon, so it's 2.5 joules limit for energy, and it's still a realistic imitation firearm. So you need to bear in mind that you still need to avail yourself of defence to buy it and to use it in a sensible manner in the appropriate setting. But aside from that, it's no different to any other single-shot weapon.
Is somebody going to come and kick your door down because you accidentally put the wrong gas in it and shoot something?
Well, you can only put CO2 in it anyway, so it's going to be as powerful as it is.
Hypothetically, is that going to happen if you go to the post office and blast Mrs. Miggins in the face because you want to rob the till? Yeah. Are you going to be done for a firearms offence?
Well, there was we had the prototype to the APS shotgun, and the prototype that we received of the APS shotgun when it came through was basically a Chinese M870 with an aluminium sleeve to stop you from putting a live in it.
Jesus Christ.
It was a shotgun, wasn't it?
This prototype you speak of, where did it go?
Smoke.
Tags. Sam Martin's brought up tags. Tags are interesting. They're not.
They're nice, I think, is probably the best way to describe them.
With tags, as far as I understand it, don't use impact.
It's 2.5 joules.
Yeah.
The impact tag rounds don't actually go off on impact. They go off 1 second after impact.
Clever.
So they go off, and in actual fact, the energy required, because when we tested them, we had a sheet of muslin cloth, and it barely moved the muslin cloth, and then it fell to the floor and went off.
So what about the 8mm thing?
Say again, sorry.
What about the 8mm thing we were talking about earlier on?
That was another thing that was brought up under the PCA because they specifically had 6mm, but again, it was
It was changed
that's
to.
With tags, if we
Ben, sorry to cut in. Specifically, under the exemption for airsoft guns, small plastic missile means a missile that blah 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 does not exceed 8mm in diameter. So 8mm got through.
So, but a tag round is in excess of 8mm.
But it's not a tag launcher. Isn't an airsoft gun.
No.
But it's a riff potentially.
But it could well be a riff.
But it's the way that shell's contained, because it's actually an explosive that launches it. It's a gas propellant launching an explosive shell. So it's actually more like throwing a firework at someone than it is firing a gun at someone.
So in terms of this public liability insurance, you would probably need to be specifically covered for blowing each other up with fireworks.
You would have to have the same insurance as you would for any other pyrotechnic that's thrown.
But pyrotechnics are covered under a separate entity sort of passage in your insurance as an airsoft gun.
When you get public liability insurance, generally, I've got the blue book from my old site here, and the PLI has a section for pyrotechnic use.
Cool.
You have to agree that with your insurer. Okay, I've got a couple of questions I've noted. What about travelling on public transport with a RIF? What are the implications of that?
Keep it covered. Keep it in a case.
We're going back to Mrs. Miggins or the man on the Clapham omnibus. Don't scare
ideally,
them.
Don't travel to the site in your kit with your tack vest on either.
Don't cause public alarm, I think, is probably the fundamental.
If you've got it in a gun slip or a case, a locked case, and you're going to a permitted event, then that's fine. If public transport's the only way you can get there, if you start playing with it on the bus or the train, you're in for a world of hurt, because British Transport Police have got really nice Lewis machine tool M4
cool
carbines. And they fire. Yeah, and their bullets are below 6mm, but they hurt a lot more.
I've actually travelled to and from work having to carry rear stigmatation firearms quite regularly.
Yeah.
Be sensible. Answer questions if asked. And if they do ask for you to open the case, request a private area to do so.
Mm-hmm. You're probably not going to get a gun pointed at your head, are you? I mean, this is something I was going to mention earlier on. Generally, the police are very good at not escalating things if they don't need to escalate it. So if you see a pleasant-looking policewoman coming knocking on your door very meekly and says, "Is there any chance we could talk to you about something, please?" Talk to her about it, and she'll probably say, "We've had a couple of reports that you might have something that looks a bit like a gun in your house. I'm sure it's probably not a gun, but is there anything around that you might think people could perceive as a gun?" And that's usually how they will approach this situation. You go, "Oh, God, yeah, my airsoft gun." And they'll say, "Right, well, can you stop waving that fucking thing around in front of the window, please? Because the old people over the road have phoned us 8 times this week, and that will probably be the end of it." If you start strutting around being a cock about it and being obstructive, they will probably come and boot your door off the hinges and have you in fucking handcuffs and pull your house apart.
Yeah, I got rear-ended on the motorway last year, and I had a gun case in the boot with an M4 and a Glock in it. And of course, the police that turned up were armed response. They were the only ones available. I just told them, there's a gun case in the boot with 2 airsoft guns in it. They opened the boot, they opened the case, they had a look. They played with them for about 5 minutes, which I'm sure was longer than they needed to. And then they just went, "Yeah, that's fine, mate. Thanks for telling us." That was it.
Be amenable, and you probably find you have a lot more in common with guys that are armed response than you'd expect.
Because they do have more of an interest, even though they're not supposed to.
They loved it. They were racking the M4, the charging handle, and racking the slide on the Glock.
Stop doing it, you'll break it!
Trains, and I've travelled quite a bit using the train network to go to the things when we have had training events and stuff as well. Try and avoid going into places like Birmingham New Street. If you can make travel plans to go into Moore Street or Snows Hill instead of going into New Street, it just lessens your chance of having a conflict with a grumpy security guy or police officer. Likewise, if you're in London, try and avoid going to some of the main stations like Paddington, and get off at a station early and walk for 5 minutes, you lazy bastard. Yeah. Whereas local stations tend not to be so bad.
Sorry, Gaz. If you must absolutely indulge in this fantasy of being some sort of paramilitary individual, just indulge in the fantasy of being the grey man that nobody notices and get stuff through without anybody noticing. Don't indulge in the fantasy if you just got off a fucking Chinook or a C-17 and you're hauling all your kit through the train station. Just pick a different fantasy to be part of, you know?
I've had to travel to places before now that have not been airsoft sites, and it's been a training event, and I've had to carry lots of kit with me, and so I've been dragging a drag bag. I've had a hard case on wheels, and then I've still had to sling a body armor or bag over my shoulder or something like that. And I've evidently had a lot of very heavy kit with me, and I've said to the people that I'm going to do things with, what do I do? And they're like, "Well, you got our number if you need to call us," and this, that, and the other. And I've never had a problem. And I've been travelling on London trains and all sorts, and I've never had a problem. In fact, the only effect I've ever had travelling to and from those things is that the train, I've finished and I've got on the train and I've been 3 or 4 days away and I've been sweaty and horrible because I'm dragging everything to the train station. And I'm on the train, the ticket collector comes around and goes, "No, don't worry about paying." And I'm like, but, no, you look like you had a hard week.
I think, kind of carrying on from this, I think I was actually talking to my partner and she had a really good point about this. It would be wise, even if you go to an open day, to book on. Yeah. Right? Because if you do get stopped and the policeman and the police officers do ring the owner of the site or the operator has a record of you intending to attend that day. It gets a little...
repairs.
Yeah. So, and someone else just brought that up. the MAF 7777, transporting an airsoft gun to a shop. So, yeah, it's kind of not strictly covered. There are exceptions for reasonable use. It sounds like an exception for reasonable use to me. But again, as Gaz has just said, if you've informed the shop you're taking it to before you set off that you're taking it to, if you do get stopped, the police officer can ring the shop and they'll go, yeah, we know MAF 7777 is coming in today.
Isn't it a bit like taking your car to get the tyres changed or have the MOT done or something like that?
Yeah, if the garage knows you're coming, yeah. If you're just driving around going, I'm going to go to the garage.
For fuck's sake, when you get to the shop, don't walk into the shop with your fucking whip in your hand. We have had that, and when we had the shop, the public shop, I had people literally walking in. We had a big sign on the door saying, if your gun is not in a bag, you will be refused entry and probably sworn at. And we did. We used to say, get the fuck out.
Yeah, we have nothing to do with you.
Yeah. Back in your car and go away. Don't want to know.
Fair one.
Because if you can't show that little bit of common sense, what are you doing in airsoft?
Yeah. So isn't the part of your defence is based on using it in a responsible fashion at events, as we've discussed. If you're not doing that, you don't really have a defence, do you?
You're not being responsible with it. Yes.
I'll be honest, this is why I disagree with the way that airsoft done these days. And we'll discuss this in a future time anyway. But the way people can easily get information and keep asking for the most basic information instead of using a little bit of common sense. If you can't use that tiny bit of sense to start airsoft, you probably shouldn't be starting it.
Yeah, and stop asking until you get the response you want, because the response you don't want is probably the right one. Don't keep asking people until they tell you something you want to hear.
Yeah.
And simple things
asking
like
30 different people the same question.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any idea how long X retailer takes to ship my order? I ordered from them yesterday, and I don't know when it's shipping. Call your fucking retailer.
Yeah, they deal with it day in, day out.
Yeah. I ordered this on 24-hour delivery on a Saturday night. Why haven't I got it? It's Sunday tea time.
Well, they're not answering the phone. It's 10:30 on a Sunday night. That'll be why.
Yeah.
Have we got to rant stage now?
Nearly. So I've just got a comment. We'll finish. We've already said it twice. We'll say it again. Nick asked, "What's the legalities around changing the colours on a 210 gun?" We know all that. If you have a legitimate defence, you can manufacture a RIF. Okay, and the legitimate defence we've outlined earlier in the show. I'm too tired to too tired and probably drunk to say it again. But if you have a legitimate defence, listen to the rest of the show. You'll find out what legitimate defence is. You can manufacture a RIF.
A guy called Harvey Mason has commented on Facebook as well and said, do you think it would be a good idea to inform your neighbours next door that you have RIFs just in case they see you playing around with them in the house back garden? It's a bit of a weird one, to be honest. Are you comfortable enough with your neighbours to go next door and say, I've got a gun?
How well do you know them? How well do you know them?
How well do you get on with them as well? If they're cantankerous, if it's Mrs. Miggins or Carol Baskin, probably best not to tell them.
I think,
Sorry, guys, go on.
Why go out in the back garden and shoot it? There's no need to. So what you have to bear in mind is your friend today may be the person that's trying to get you some harm tomorrow. So you might get on with your neighbours today, but then because your cat pissed in their garden, they suddenly decide to report you to the police for having firearms. And they won't say they're replicas, even though they know.
Guns.
Say that guns.
And then the goon squad is coming down through the door.
It's a bit of an odd one, isn't it? If you've got on with these neighbours for 20 odd years and your nan goes round for a cup of tea or something like that, you can say, "Oh, is it all right if Harvey shoots his gun?" And let's be honest, you don't have an entitlement to shoot your gun and cause an embuggerance to your neighbours, to use Gadgey's favourite term. You don't actually have an entitlement to cause your neighbours irritation. So shooting BBs, and if one goes out of your property, you are probably already overstepped the mark already.
But then you're discharging an air weapon beyond the bounds of your property, but that's a whole other discussion.
How much shooting did we do, Tom, when we got the attack sense targets?
we had a legitimate use. We were filming, but anyway, that's another.
Yeah.
But yes, there is
a safety net.
But there is a consideration
there. If your neighbours
there.
want to come round and have a go, and they're willing to don some iPro and maybe come round for a barbecue or something like that, you're probably unsafe around.
So okay,
if you're not that close to them,
Gaz,
you don't need to go around saying I've got things that look like guns, because you'll probably cause undue alarm.
I'm in an interesting situation in that my neighbours do not know what I have, but the police do.
Okay.
So even if a neighbour found out that I had a gun, because they see me loading a van, when we're loading a van for an exercise or whatever, and we're putting massive boxes full of AKs in there. They can't see the AKs, but gun box is a gun box. Big black cases are big black cases. So in the event that they ever did say anything, the police already know, because the police actually bring new people here. They haven't done for a while, but they bring new beat officers here to shut them up.
There's just you putting 48 bottles of bleach in the back of a white van in the drive.
We used to have something where the local beat manager, when they were a thing, used to bring round, because I live in a city, used to bring round new coppers, and they'd tell the copper that they were doing a knock, that they were following up an inquiry, when he'd actually rang me beforehand. So he'd say, "Can I bring someone round?" And then they'd knock on the door, and you open the door to them, and they say, "Oh, Mr. Perkins, we need to discuss allegations made against you regarding a firearm. Can I come in?" And I go, "Yeah, of course you can come in," and start acting all cagey with them, and then of course lead them into the armoury. At which point, the new officer would generally shit themselves.
I think as funny as it is, Gaz, just because this is a live stream and people might come into it, it's probably a really, really good idea to reinforce the fact that you do have a quite special situation and a bit of a special relationship with the local authorities, don't you?
Yeah,
okay.
I work very, very closely with both the local police and also some of the other police in nearby regions as well. So we've, over the years, lessened it to an extent, but from many years ago, from the 90s, we used to, as a club, this is before PLI and before Chronoing, we used to actually use land lent to us by the local council, and then any time the police would come across kids playing with airsoft guns, they would ring us to take the kids in to teach them how to use airsoft guns in a responsible setting, i.e. skirmishing. And this nice airsoft sites. It was great. And we used to go to their firearms club, their firearms ranges, because we've got the local college here, which trains all the local firearms officers. So we've built a long-term relationship, and my beat manager just liked winding up newbies and using me.
I think that's a really great place to end on. So I'd like to say a massive thank you to my guests, Phil, Ben and Gaz today. Absolutely brilliant discussion. I really hope. And we've still got 44 people watching, so I think it's been a really valuable thing to do. And thanks to everyone that's asked questions and joined us for the stream. It sounds like we need to do a follow-up from this, which is just a bit more ranting, but a bit more history and talking about stuff and applications and things as well. Yeah, so we'll do that.
I'm just really sad I missed Gaz talking about the gas blowback guns, to be honest, because I want to go back to that one.
Watch that one.
So if you want, Phil, do you want to share where you are on social media?
Yeah, Facebook at Clearwater Airsoft or Instagram Clearwater_Airsoft.
Ben, do you care?
It's probably best because right now it is literally just pictures of me running around on Strava and probably the odd beer or bread or something like that. So I'll let you find me if you want to find me, because it's not particularly airsoft relevant these days.
Gaz, do you care?
I'm not necessarily on social media in a business sense, so
fine. Okay, it's just one of those ones. Yeah. Okay, so
thanks
again.
It's not about us.
I'll shut down the stream in just a minute. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks to my guests for appearing on the stream. We will definitely get everyone together again, because we've had a really good time. It looks like you guys have had a really good time listening to us waffling on. Next time we'll get some questions from you guys, so we have a bit of structure. But thank you so much, guys. If you hang on, we'll have a chat, and I'm just going to finish the stream now. Thanks, guys. Brilliant.
Thanks a lot, Tom.